Hey everyone, my name is Martin and I'd like to welcome you back for this week's video in which we'll be going over another song from The Weeknd's Dawn FM album called How Do I Make You Love Me. Now, before we delve into the production process, I'd like to encourage you to watch this production breakdown until the end for you to maximize your learning potential from this video. And I also want you to feel free to ask me any questions you might have in the comments below or on my Instagram page so that I can help you. Now, without any further ado, let's make a deep dive into the session. To begin things off, I'm using a ton of Omnisphere in this project, and that's simply because Omnisphere offers some really good replications of some of the best analog synths out there. And one of these sounds is the synth that plays the following chords in the verse. So if we take a look at the piano roll, we see that there is a bit of strumming going on in between the chords that adds this subtle sense of humanization and imperfection to the attack of the chords. And you can especially hear this in these 4-note chords in the 3rd and the 4th bar of the verse. So for this synth, I'm using the Sawbrass from the 80s patch, which features the super famous Moog synth as well as the Oberheim SEM. And in Omnisphere itself, we see that there's already some smooth processing going on. We see a chorus effect and a reverb. But I wanted to make the synth stand out a bit more and also to sound a bit beefier. And that is why I applied some additional processing, including a decapitator that has a slight bit of drive to give the synth a more forward presence to the listener. I'm also a huge fan of the free Telchorus plugin, which is actually modeled after the chorus effect on the Juno 60 synth, and in my opinion, this plugin offers a really rich sound when applied in the right amount. We also have an S1 imager from Waves to widen the sound, and lastly some compression to kind of even out any spikes or peaks in the background of the synth, and this makes the synth sit in the mix a little better. So if this 80s brass was the only synth playing in this 20-bar verse, things would probably get a little repetitive, which is why the original producers added some amazing synths in the background. And one of these is this really cool Euro club saw from the Jupiter 8 that sounds very old school, and yet it works really well to keep things interesting in the verse and to kind of interact with The Weeknd's vocal in a really nice and dynamic way. So I'm using RC20 to make the synth sound a little more analog and retro, which adds a nice touch of warmth and distortion and also tames some of the very high-end frequencies of the sound. Then what's also interesting to highlight is this volume automation clip that I created to make the synth end in a really abrupt way by getting rid of its release and reverb tails, which makes things a little tighter in the verse. Then a couple of bars later, we hear this other synth that I really love, which I remade using this Octaplug preset from the Juno 60, and that sounds like this. So on this Sounds mixer channel, there is a Telchorus for some extra texture, an RC20 to further emphasize the sound's retro characteristics, an EQ to cut out most of the sound's lows, an S1 imager for some added width, and an Echo Boy to emulate a left and right ping-pong delay effect, which kind of makes the synth play in the background for a little longer and adds a nice touch of atmosphere to the verse. So here's what our synths sound like when we combine them. Now, of course, the verse is not complete without the drums, which are at least as noteworthy as the synths in this one, and especially this kick pattern, which is quite a unique format compared to what we're used to hearing. So for the kick, I'm using this Lin kick sample, and this one sounds quite thin without any processing. And that's why I'm using a radiator to add a bit of a warm analog touch, especially to the kick's low end, as well as a wave shaper, which is a free plugin in FL Studio, to add a bit of drive and punch to the kick. And finally, I'm using the Maserati drum plugin by Waves, which makes the kick sound larger and heavier in the mix, especially through this thumb knob over here, which is set to around 2 o'clock. We also have a snare playing on the 2 and the 4, sometimes even skipping the 4, which puts a bit more emphasis on the kick pattern and kind of makes the drum pattern a little more unpredictable, but in a good way. And the snare sound is mainly shaped through these 2 EQs over here, which get rid of the snare's digital sounding high end and unnecessary low frequencies, as well as add quite a bit of presence at around 5K, making the snare punch through the mix a little better. We then also have this vintage verb to add a bit of retro reverb, but I do not want this one to include too many high frequencies, as that will easily make the reverb sound too modern and obvious. And I'm finally also automating the reverb's mix level to make its tail a bit shorter and tighter. Then finalizing the drums is the Linn Cabasa, which sounds like a shaker, and this one is panned to the left, but because of the Pancake plugin, you can also hear the sound's delay move to the right, which is a nice little detail, and together with the kick and the snare, the Cabasa creates a solid groove with some really cool 80s vibes. I'm also routing all drum sounds to a drum bus, where I'm using the SSL compressor by Waves, and this one just really binds all the different drum elements together in a nice analog fashion. As we then head to the pre-chorus, we are greeted by this amazing polysynth, for which I'm using the Jupiter 8 Bright PWM preset. And what I love about this section is how the synth plays different chords on top of the same bass note, which makes it sound very 80s and also creates so much tension, which is awesome. So in terms of processing, I wanted the synth to feel really huge and also kind of plucky. And to achieve that, I'm using the DS10 drum shaper. And what this one does is highlight the sound's transients by boosting its attack and producing its sustain, making it sound tighter, a little more like a synth plug. I'm then using a glue compressor to make sure that the synth is more in the face of the listener, followed by an OTT to add a ton of brightness, tel chorus for extra thickness, an EQ to cut any unnecessary lows and to make the high end a little easier on the ears, and an S1 imager to widen the synth. And this actually also creates more space for the other synths to play in the middle of the mix. And then we still need to add this stadium effect to our synth, for which I'm using a vintage verb, which just adds a ton of expansion and depth to the synth, and an Echo Boy delay, which creates this arpeggiating echo effect that really is the icing on the cake in my opinion. Now, there's another interesting feature about this synth that I'd like to show you, which is the way it is introduced through this reverse synth sweep. So I created this by simply adding a large reverb to the synth's mixer channel and recording only the first chord in Edison. Then I sent this recording to the playlist as an audio clip, and inside the audio clip settings I selected the reverse option, which basically flips the recording horizontally, creating this nice sweep. But I wanted the sweep to be introduced in a more subtle way, which is why I added DJM filter, and I automated the filter cutoff so that it kind of emerges from this low pass filter that slowly opens as we move closer to the pre-chorus. And in this pre-chorus, there is some other cool synths that I'd like to show you, like the Silent One synth arpeggio that creates suspense and builds up the energy. If we take a look at the sound design, the synth really just consists of 2 detuned saw waves, one of which has 8 voices and is panned to the left, and the other one has 4 voices and is panned to the right, which I then processed to make it a bit less sharp and harsh, which is basically achieved through this instance of RC20, which adds a nice bit of wobble and distortion, but also takes away some of that harsh high end we were talking about. I'm then layering this synth with a Juno 60 sample to add more body and character to the overall ARP sound, and I mainly achieved this using the capitator for a more alive sounding perception, a tel chorus for a more full and more 80s style sound, a low pass filter, a vintage verb, and an Echo Boy to accentuate this arpeggio. Another sound playing in the pre-chorus is this power bass station from Trillion, which plays the same bass note for 6 bars and then changes itself to F and D sharp to play in line with the synth chords. Now, to make the bass fit within the rest of the elements, I'm using an EQ, which removes some of the sound's low end and low mids for a less bloated effect, and I'm also using the Wotu plugin to create this vowel filter effect, which adds a little more character to our bass sound. As we then almost reach the chorus, there is this really cool analog synth from Omnisphere, which plays the notes D sharp, G, and A sharp. So basically a D sharp major chord, but in an arpeggiated way. And this one serves as a synth fill to mark the end of the pre-chorus and to transition into the chorus more smoothly. And the Echo Boy delay I'm using here makes this transition even more subtle because it kind of closes this gap between the pre-chorus and the chorus without being too noticeable. So as we arrive at the chorus, we see that a lot of the synths we have discussed so far are being reused. There is the Sawbrass from the 80s, but now with an OTT on its mixer channel. There's the Eurostadium synth, but now with a low-pass filter to provide the vocals with a little more space. There's the synth arps from Silent One and the Juno 60. And again, at the 8th bar of the chorus, there is our synth fill. So I've linked all of these synths to a sidechain bus, to which I sidechained the kick using the sidechain to this track option. And I did this to make sure that each synth ducks in the same way whenever the kick is played, and also to prevent that I had to load a sidechain plugin on each individual synth's mixer channel. Now, next to these already existing synths, the chorus also contains some new elements, especially in the lower end of our frequency spectrum, like this 808 from the Dyro pack, which serves as our sub-bass layer. And I tried to make this one sound really deep by using analog emulator plugins like Decapitator for saturation and Radiator for warmth, and also by only preserving the frequency range from 25 to around 100 Hz. To then fill up the space in the frequencies above 100 Hz, I'm using this CS80 sound from Trillion. So this one serves as a top layer to the bass, and what I did here was basically just cut all the lows below 100 Hz so it does not interfere with our sub, and I also got rid of some of the more muddy frequencies between 150 and 200 Hz. Then I also automated the sound's filter resonance knob to create some movement and to make it sound a bit more interesting, and I did something similar to the sound's pitch envelope to create the following downslide effect. And just like the synths, I've linked both the 808 and the CS80 bass to a bass bus, to which I'm sidechaining the kick, and this ensures that our kick and bass do not interfere with one another, and that just keeps things clean at the bottom end of our mix. Then there's still some other new elements in the chorus, like this Jonas Aiden kick, which is a lot more powerful and punchy than the kick we're using in the verse. And I'm processing this one using instances of DS10 and the glue. Then there's also this closed hi-hat playing every 16th note for more rhythm and movement, as well as this cool hand clap with quite some reverb, which serves as a fill both before and during the chorus segment. So let's take a listen to the drums in the chorus as they play together. Finally, just like in my Sacrifice remake, I'm using some effects to really just enhance certain parts of the production, like this extended sweep in the pre-chorus that creates some tension leading up to the chorus. Also, we have this clap sound with a large reverb tail at the start of the chorus. And this one is supported by this subtle sweep down sample, and together these two really just make the chorus hit harder. Another trick I'm applying to make the chorus hit harder is automating the master volume, and this just adds a tiny bit of extra power and punch, as you'll be able to hear when we A/B this automation clip. Lastly, I'm also using some effects on the master chain to really just polish the overall sound and tonality of our song. I'm starting the master with the SSL compressor and the linear phase multiband compressor by Waves to really glue all the elements in the production together. And both of these really just magically make the mix sound better just by being enabled, which is great. Then another one of these magical plugins, especially for songs that need this touch of vintage warmth and retro feel, is the Abbey Road Vinyl. So I'm using the Mixbus Hi-Fi preset, and the best way to describe what this preset is doing to our mix is by muting this plugin. So we noticed that the mix just loses so much warmth and depth as we disable this plugin, which is why I'm definitely not afraid to use some of its magic on my master chain. And our master is then wrapped up by the invisible limiter, which brings our mix to the right volume level without compromising the quality and sound of the mix too much. And that's exactly what makes this specific plugin so good at what it does, as it really tries to minimize the difference between the original sound and the limited sound. And that wraps up our production breakdown. I'd like to thank you for watching, and as always, you can download the free project file, the stems and the MIDI files in the description below. Also, feel free to leave a like on this video and to send me a message on my Instagram to say hi. So let's now listen to the final result of this production breakdown, and I'll see you next video.